was in the context of the 1960s. I mean, it was just a period of immense turmoil in the U.S.
6 days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. It took the appearance of 14,000 troops to bring an end to what both Negro and white leaders called insurrection by hoodlum.
The students sat in as planned. The police did nothing to protect them.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And the Jesuit general, Pedro Arrupe, gave a pretty important directive and said that Jesuit schools had to think seriously about what they were doing and had to do more to bring blacks into the mainstream. And we started here what was first called the Negro Talent Program.
Black Talent, you know, it was a unique program. It was the only program of its kind in the country at the time that I knew of. And, you know, it was a response to some of these, you know, requests from the Civil Rights Movement. It was a response by the country in an attempt to integrate more folks of color into the mainstream. You know, if you want to pull yourself up by your bootstraps, so to speak, education was probably one of the more recognizable ways to do that.
He wanted these kids to take control of their own lives and their own program. And I believe his ideal was that this would be a huge step in developing a group of young black leaders. At the time, all the universities had started to rush to try to recruit more black students. This after the Kerner Commission report. And so the competition was fierce for high school students with good records who happened to be black. Imagine these kids, the dominant kids here, who were first generation college students, working really very, very hard to pay the bills. And they see a group of young black students on the campus now with a full ride. And that gave rise to some tension.
When the Black Talent Program was being ended and it was being renamed to the Minority Student Program, there was a lot of ambulance on behalf of the students. Don Brown will say that some students approached him and said, as long as you use, or your office used the name minority, we're not going to come to your office. There were nightly meetings about discussions about how to shape and come up with a name that would be acceptable to both the students and the administration. Someone suggested, and they finally made it AHANA, and I think that was the term that people pretty much agreed on.
The term minority was seen as denigrating, that people felt like that meant you were less than. And so by changing the term from minority to AHANA, it was an empowering sort of thing. It created pride, it did, and it created a sense of you know, sort of self-esteem at the time.
So as a replacement for the term minority strengthens the population it's supposed to represent. And I think with the 30th anniversary campaign, we really tried to move the acronym forward as not representing these individual races, but representing multiculturalism at Boston College.
AHANA in its simplest form is just a term to categorize people on campus.
It kind of brings together the different races that it includes and kind of fosters a community where we come together and are together much stronger.
The AHANA community is not exclusive. The acronym is. But that does not mean that you can't seek knowledge. That does not mean that you can't befriend an AHANA student. AHANA is not a student group on campus. It is a way to identify yourself.
It does encompass all groups and welcomes all groups as not really these individual races that we're trying to label in a more politically correct way, but actually taking the term and making it mean something where anyone can buy in as long as they care about the issues that affect students of color.
This idea of AHANA is something that makes people feel good about themselves, that empowers students, that instills a sense of pride and encouragement, which we needed.
It's not meant to be complicated, but unfortunately it is, both here at Boston College and in the U.S.
The founding of ALC in, I guess it was the spring of 1995, coincided with a time period on campus of great political turmoil. In spring of 1994, there was a historic occurrence on this campus where you had the first ever AHANA team to win the UGBC election. So the first time where you had the president and vice president were AHANA students. It was actually Boston Globe. The front page of the Boston Globe covered the fact that BC had elected its first ever AHANA team to take control of the UGBC. This was seen as almost a historic thing in this area, and it was in many ways, considering the history of Boston College itself. I would say most people would agree that year, that academic year, 94, 95, had more of its share of disruption, disunity, and a feeling of sort of tension between groups. There was, a lot of there was a lot of sort of like ferment going on. There was just a lot of dialogues happening that would turn bitter, or would turn sort of angry, or become kind of disruptive. And different groups began to form around that. There was something that started this off, as happens occasionally at Boston College. Somebody said something that was inappropriate, or that most people considered to be inappropriate, on the sort of like on the moderate side. People saw it as inappropriate. Some people felt like it was even almost sort of like racist. And so things happened. Someone would write something. Inevitably, somebody would write a racially unacceptable slur or something on someone's door, or unacceptable language would be used, or racist epithets would be used openly in some cases. And so, how do you deal with that? How do you cope with that when really you're here to get an education? I think when some of these protests broke out, which they had before, this was not the first time, and this is a cherished tradition at Boston College. Apparently, is having a rally, but it really seemed to break out that year. I think most people from that time period would say that was a pretty intense time to be a student at Boston College. They were giving lectures out on the quad, and a lot of professors, instead of having class, were taking their students. Instead of meeting in the classroom, they said, we're going to go out and listen to these speeches. Students of color who had sort of been kind of quiet and sort of like invisible, finding their voices, teaching the rest of this community about what it meant to be an AHANA student at Boston College, testifying about it. They were teaching some of the students who came from European backgrounds about something called white privilege and how to deconstruct it. They were teaching faculty about academic privilege and the arrogance of that, and how to be more open to students of color in their classrooms. What happens when the students become the teachers? These were not just sort of like off the top of the head. These were these were well researched, rich with information, with history. They were factually accurate in most cases. They were talking about sort of high-minded political ideals like freedom. I mean, and not just saying they wanted freedom, but explaining the nature of it. That had never happened before, that I know. They were teaching, you'd have to say. They were teaching everyone on this campus about the true nature of racism, the true nature of race. It was a real dynamic discussion, very rich sort of dialogue about various issues. I think, I have to, this is the 1990s, and the 90s in general were kind of a rough time racially. It was filled with racial tension. The OJ trial, all of these kinds of incidents, Rodney King beating the LA riots earlier, that was the context out of which ALC was founded. AHANA Leadership Council came out of some of those dialogues. It came out of some of the discourse that was happening around diversity. We were having a fairly high-level discussion at the student level about leadership, about politics, about racial politics, about change, about coalition building. And of course, that's been an ongoing dialogue for a long time. But because of the political climate and the situation happening with UGBC at the time, I think it just heightened that sense.
I can't honestly say that Boston College is moving in the right direction as far as creating more racial talk on campus. I think the people who are currently spearheading these movements or I guess trying to spread knowledge about the AHANA community are the people in the AHANA community, and I think they aren't the people who necessarily hold the power in our society. And if you look at a more micro level here at Boston College, the administration and their demographics, I don't really see the support coming from them. I don't see many faculty at student events. I understand that there are many conflicts and other lives to care about, but at the same time, I think that it's their responsibility to set an example or to encourage the students to attend events that seem unpopular and seem maybe not uninteresting, but different, challenging.
I think while I was here, the demographics have to some extent remained the same. I know last year we brought in the largest class of African American students, and that's a huge accomplishment for BC because that means they're really working on recruiting more students and getting them to apply who are of different backgrounds. I think overall the demographics of BC changed significantly in the past decade or so, but now they're kind of starting to stagnate where about 25% of the campus is of AHANA descent. I think also BC is really looking to push forward as an elite university, and that really requires it to recruit, I guess, students that are not only contribute to the diversity of the campus, but also are capable of contributing academically, contributing in other ways to student life and things like that. And therefore, I think the students they kind of look for prevents them from really diversifying the campus more than they want right now.
Change in general is difficult because of continuous perpetuations of the same stereotypes and the same beliefs. Change here at Boston College is difficult because I think it's just the traditions of the university. I love the fact that Boston College is this conservative. This is the reason why I came here, and all the aspects of Boston College is what I looked forward to. But I think that when you become so involved in student organizations and you try and create events that are not only educating but fun for students to come to, and you get judged for it, I think it kind of discourages you from creating those events. And it's not necessarily that you're trying to make a change, but you're trying to educate people, and I think that's where change starts, when you've already had so many of these stereotypes and preconceived notions thrown at you since you were born.
BC is a kind of place that brings together so many people from such different backgrounds. You might have students here who, went to private schools, went to, some of them who come from affluent areas, from privileged backgrounds, in a dorm or even sharing a room with someone who comes from an urban area or from an underprivileged background. It's one of the strengths of Boston College, but it can also be a source of tension.
I think a major issue on campus is that we have diversified significantly, and that we haven't really met that change with the adequate resources. We've put in money to, like the Office of AHANA Student Programs, the Office of Institutional Diversity. They really work on making the environment more accepting to students of color, students of different backgrounds, low socioeconomic class, etc. But we haven't really invested in educational initiatives to really get rid of ignorance on campus, especially when people are raised with one background for 18 years and then come to college where they're exposed to people of multiple backgrounds, whether it be racial, socioeconomic, cultural. And I think a major problem with the current core is that we don't try and mandate that sort of education, especially early on during freshman year. And I think that's something we really need to look at, looking at the current cultural diversity core and figuring out how maybe adding on to that or getting rid of it and changing it, because it's not really about understanding a certain aspect, like learning about Asian history or learning about, business strategies for diverse organizations. I think you really have to address the different psychological, sociological issues, and also the issues in society as well that pertain to students of different backgrounds, so we can all understand each other and therefore come together as one community.
Before I came to Boston College, I think I didn't have as much racial dialogue as before. Even growing up in a Mexican household, I think that's also very suffocating because you don't get exposure to white dominant culture, and that can severely impact your chances of making it in the real world.
What I would say in general, what I like to see in the future is for students to learn about their past, so that, because everything that former students have obtained until today, I think it's something that needs to be built upon. So it's not necessary to recreate the wheel. So it's important to learn the history and learn about what other students have done in the past and build upon what they have already done. So I think that that's important. So it's important for the students, those of you who are student leaders now, to document what you're doing now, and then make sure that it gets passed on to the new generations of students so that they can build upon what you have already done. They don't have to come and start from scratch. So I think in general that's the most important piece that I want to make sure that I do. And also for students to really value what students before them have done. and not take for granted all that they have currently, because for the most part, every opportunity that they have now, students that came before them either demanded or advocated for those opportunities to be possible here now.
It was in the context of the 1960s. I mean, it was just a period of immense turmoil in the U.S.
6 days of rioting in a Negro section of Los Angeles left behind scenes reminiscent of war-torn cities. It took the appearance of 14,000 troops to bring an end to what both Negro and white leaders called
college students working really very, very hard to pay the bills. And they see a group of young black students on the campus now with a full ride. And that gave rise to some tension.
When the Black Talent Program was being ended and was being renamed to the Minority Student Program, there was a lot of ambulance on behalf of the students. Don Brown will say that some students approached him and said, as long as you use, or your office used the name minority, we're not going to come to your office. There were nightly meetings, so to speak. Education was probably one of the more recognizable ways to do that.
He wanted these kids to take control of their own lives and their own program. And I believe his ideal was that this would be a huge step in developing a group of young black leaders. At the time, all the universities had started to rush to try to recruit more black students. This after the Kerner Commission report. And so the competition was fierce for high school students with good records who happened to be black. Imagine these kids, the dominant kids here, were first generation Jesuit schools, had to think seriously about what they were doing and had to do more to bring blacks into the mainstream. And we started here what was first called the Negro Talent Program.
Black Talent, you know, it was a unique program. It was the only program of its kind in the country at the time that I knew of. And, you know, it was a response to some of these, you know, requests from the Civil Rights Movement. It was a response by the country in an attempt to integrate more folks of color into the mainstream. You know, if you want to pull yourself up by your bootstraps.
Insurrection by hoodlum.
The students sat in as planned. The police did nothing to protect them.
I have a dream that one day this nation will rise up and live out the true meaning of its creed. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal.
And the Jesuit general, Pedro Arrupe, gave a pretty important directive.